Today, we will uncover an Everest climb where two TikTok influencers mocked their Sherpa and paid the price. Focused on chasing views, they treated his warnings like a joke and the mountain like a set. And high in the death zone, one decision turned that arrogance into something no one could ever take back. It was April 19th, 2017, and the pre-dawn air at Everest Base Camp held the crystalline cold of air hovering near 0 degrees Fahrenheit. The sprawling tent city at 17,600 feet was beginning its daily rhythm. The hiss of stoves firing up in mess tents, the crunch of boots on frozen ground, the low murmur of climbers preparing for the day's rotations. Prayer flags strung between camps snapped in the wind, their colors muted in the darkness. Headlamps bobbed between tents like fireflies, illuminating small pockets of activity against the vast blackness of the Khumbu Glacier. The Khumbu icefall loomed above base camp, unseen in the darkness, but impossible to forget. It was Everest's first real test, a shifting maze of crevasses, ladders, and unstable seraks that moved as the glacier crept downhill. Climbers crossed aluminum ladders over open gaps, climbed steep ice on fixed ropes, and passed beneath towering blocks that could collapse without warning. Those who knew the mountain moved through it fast before sunrise, when the overnight cold offered the only margin of safety. Among the climbers preparing that morning were Brianna Cole and Madison Hart, both from Orange County, California. Brianna was 24, a social media creator who had built a following of 180,000 across TikTok and Instagram by documenting fitness challenges and adventure travel. Her content occupied the intersection of aspiration and accessibility, posts that made extreme experiences feel achievable to followers who lived conventional lives. She had started with marathon training videos, progressed to adventure race, and eventually discovered that mountaineering content generated exceptional engagement. Her audience responded to the drama of high-altitude climbing, the visual spectacle of summits, and the narrative of pushing personal limits. Madison, 23, served as Brianna's climbing partner and content collaborator. She managed filming, edited footage, and appeared in videos as the supportive friend who made Brianna's achievements feel relatable rather than alienating. Their partnership worked because Madison understood the performance aspect of social media creation, how to frame shots, when to inject humor, how to manufacture authenticity. Together, they had climbed Kilimanjaro, Elbrus, and Aconcagua over the previous 18 months. Each expedition documented extensively and monetized through sponsorships with outdoor gear companies. Everest represented their most ambitious project. They had secured sponsorships from 3 companies, an energy drink brand, a technical outerwear manufacturer, and a fitness app that collectively covered 70% of their expedition costs. The remaining 30% was funded through a Patreon campaign where followers paid monthly subscriptions for exclusive content from the mountain. They had promised daily updates, behind-the-scenes footage, and raw documentation of what Everest really looked like beyond the polished summit photos that dominated social media. What they lacked was significant high-altitude experience under technical conditions. Their previous climbs had been guided expeditions on mountains that required endurance more than technical skill. Neither had extensive training with crevasse rescue, ice climbing, or the judgment required to navigate terrain where mistakes could kill immediately. They compensated with fitness. Both were genuinely strong, capable of carrying loads and maintaining pace at altitude, and confidence that their previous summits proved they belonged on Everest. Their Sherpa guide was Ngawang Tashi, 37 years old, from Fortse village in the Khumbu Valley. Ngawang had summited Everest 9 times across a 14-year guiding career, and worked as a rope-fixing team member on 3 separate seasons, spending weeks each spring installing the fixed lines that allowed commercial clients to attempt the summit. His face showed the weathering of sustained high-altitude exposure, deep creases around his eyes, skin darkened by years of glacier glare, a quiet intensity that came from witnessing how quickly mountains killed people who underestimated them. Ngawang supported a family that included his wife, 2 children, and his aging parents. His income as a climbing Sherpa exceeded what most Khumbu residents could earn through trekking's lodge work or farming, but it came at a cost measured in risk and physical degradation. Each season, above 26,000 feet, damaged his body in ways that accumulated, deteriorating eyesight from UV exposure, chronic joint pain, and respiratory issues that worsened each winter. He guided because the money allowed his children to attend good schools in Kathmandu, because it gave his family security, and because mountaineering was the trade he knew. The expedition company that had hired Ngawang specialized in mid-tier commercial climbs, not the premium operators that screened clients carefully and maintained strict safety protocols, but not the budget companies that accepted anyone with payment. They occupied a middle zone where client qualification varied widely, and Sherpas bore the responsibility of managing whoever showed up. Ngawang had worked for them twice before without incident, though both previous seasons had involved clients who treated the mountain with appropriate seriousness. Brianna and Madison represented something different. From the first days at base camp, Ngawang noticed their priorities were inverted. They treated filming as the primary objective and climbing as the backdrop. During safety briefings about crevasse rescue procedures, they repeatedly interrupted to adjust camera angles. When Ngawang explained the dangers of the icefall, how seraks collapsed during warm hours, how ladder crossings required focused attention, how speed through the hazard zone meant survival, they nodded but continued scrolling through their phones, reviewing footage from earlier in the day. The pattern repeated during acclimatization hikes around base camp. They would ask Ngawang to pause mid-explanation so they could film, then resume as if the interruption hadn't broken his train of thought. They referred to him in their videos using generic terms rather than his name, treating him as interchangeable set dressing rather than the person whose judgment would determine their survival. When they posted content, the captions focused on their personal journey, their courage, their preparation, their determination, with minimal acknowledgement of the Sherpa support that made their presence on the mountain possible. Ngawang had worked with difficult clients before. Mountains attracted personalities that ranged from humble to insufferable, and professional Sherpas learned to manage egos as part of the job. But what concerned him more than their attitude was their readiness. During practice sessions on the glacier near base camp, simple exercises with crampons and ice axes on moderate terrain, both women showed technical weaknesses that had no place on Everest. Madison's crampon technique was sloppy, her foot placements imprecise. Brianna's balance on steep ice was uncertain, her movements tentative rather than confident. These were skills that needed to be automatic before entering the icefall, where hesitation meant exposure to danger and mistakes often proved immediately fatal. When Ngawang raised these concerns with the expedition leader, he was told the clients had signed extensive waivers acknowledging the risks. Unless they became unable to move under their own power or showed signs of severe altitude sickness, the expedition would continue. The leader added that the company had received feedback that Ngawang could be overly cautious with Western clients and reminded him that their business model depended on successful summits and satisfied customers. The first rotation through the icefall was scheduled for April 20th. Departures began at 3:30 in the morning, when the temperature dropped into the teens and the ice remained frozen solid. Teams left in staggered intervals, 10-minute gaps between groups to prevent crowding on the fixed lines and reduce the number of people clustered beneath unstable serak. The evening before the crossing, Ngawang gathered Brianna and Madison in the mess tent for a final briefing. He explained the route in detail, the sections that required careful attention, the areas where they needed to move quickly, the protocol for ladder crossings. He emphasized timing. Departing before dawn was critical. The icefall became exponentially more dangerous as the sun rose and temperatures climbed. Seraks that seemed stable in the cold could shift and collapse once solar radiation began working into the structure. Every hour spent in the icefall after sunrise increased the risk of being crushed by falling ice or caught in an avalanche triggered by unstable blocks. Brianna's response made clear she had not absorbed the message. She asked whether they could delay their departure by an hour to allow better lighting for filming. The darkness made capturing quality footage difficult, and her audience expected strong visual content. Ngawang explained that better lighting came at the cost of significantly increased danger, and the filming could be done on subsequent rotations once she understood the route. Brianna pushed back, noting that they had paid substantial fees, specifically for flexibility in their climbing schedule. When Ngawang repeated that departing late risked their lives, Madison added that they understood the risks and were comfortable making their own decisions about timing. The exchange left Ngawang frustrated and worried. Their confidence was detached from the reality of what the icefall demanded. They spoke as if risk was something they could manage through determination, rather than something that existed independently of their beliefs about themselves. He made one final attempt, describing a collapse he had witnessed 3 years earlier. a serak the size of a small building that detached during a late morning warmth and crushed 2 climbers who had departed after sunrise. The details were specific: the sound of ice cracking, the impossibility of escape, the bodies they recovered days later. Brianna responded that she appreciated his concern, but felt confident in their preparation. Hey, quick reminder that if this kind of in-depth coverage matters to you, subscribing and leaving a like helps support the channel make more videos like this. Now let's get back to the mountain. The following morning, Ngawang woke at 2:15 and began his preparations. He dressed in layers, checked his headlamp batteries, and verified his climbing equipment: harness, carabiners, ascender, ice axe. At 3 o'clock, he walked to Brianna and Madison's tent and called through the vestibule that they needed to begin moving. The response came back muffled. They were awake and getting ready. Ngawang waited outside in the cold, watching other teams depart toward the icefall entrance, their headlamps disappearing into the darkness. At 3:40, the women emerged from their tent. They wore appropriate layers and carried their equipment, but their movements lacked urgency. Madison paused to adjust camera settings. Brianna checked her phone, scrolling briefly before tucking it into an inner pocket. When Ngawang stated they were already behind schedule, Brianna responded that 10 minutes wouldn't matter. They followed him toward the icefall entrance at a pace that felt deliberately casual, as if rushing would undermine the confidence they wanted to project. The icefall route began at the base of the glacier, marked by a small altar where climbers performed pujas, ceremonies seeking safe passage through the mountain's most dangerous terrain. Ngawang paused at the altar briefly, a habit he maintained every crossing. Brianna and Madison continued past without stopping, their focus on getting started. Quick reminder, if this kind of in-depth breakdown matters to you, subscribing helps keep these stories coming. Now let's get back to the mountain. The first section involved navigating between ice blocks the size of cars, following a winding path marked by wands. The terrain was relatively flat, but the darkness made every step uncertain. Headlamps created tunnels of light that illuminated only what was directly ahead, leaving peripheral vision black. The sound of the glacier was constant, creaking, groaning, the occasional sharp crack of ice, shifting under its own weight. Madison wanted to film the initial section. She stopped to set up a shot, positioning herself to capture Brianna, crossing a narrow section between 2 crevasses. Ngawang stopped ahead and waited, his headlamp pointing back toward them. The delay stretched to 3 minutes, then 4, while Madison adjusted angles and retook the crossing multiple times until she was satisfied. When they resumed moving, Ngawang said nothing, but checked his watch and calculated the time they were losing. The ladder crossings began around 4:30. The first ladder spanned a crevasse approximately 12 feet wide, the aluminum flexing slightly with each step. Brianna crossed slowly, testing each rung before committing her weight, her breathing audible in the still air. Madison followed, her crampon points scraping against the metal rungs. On the far side, they paused to film a selfie-style video with the ladder visible behind them. Ngawang watched from ahead, his frustration building into something sharper. They were treating the icefall like a photo shoot location, rather than a place where people died regularly. The route climbed higher, weaving through increasingly chaotic terrain. Some sections required ascending near vertical ice walls, using fixed ropes and ice screws as anchors. Other sections traversed beneath massive seraks, unstable towers of ice that could collapse without warning. Ngawang moved efficiently, his experience allowing him to read the terrain and choose the fastest safe line. Behind him, Brianna and Madison stopped frequently, their pace erratic. By 5:15, the sky was beginning to lighten. The darkness shifted to deep blue, then gradually toward the gray that preceded sunrise. Ngawang could see the route ahead more clearly now, which meant he could also see how far they still had to go. They were approximately 40% through the icefall, moving far slower than he had planned. His original timeline had them clearing the most dangerous sections before sunrise. That was no longer possible. At 5:40, with dawn breaking across the glacier, they reached a relatively flat section between 2 major hazard zones. Ngawang used the pause to check their condition. Both women were breathing heavily, their faces flushed despite the cold. Madison's coordination seemed slightly off. She fumbled with her carabiner while clipping into the next section of fixed line. Ngawang asked if they needed to rest. Brianna said they were fine and ready to continue. What happened next stunned Ngawang enough that he would later struggle to describe it without anger. Brianna proposed they stop to film. The lighting was perfect now, the soft glow of sunrise illuminating the ice. the dramatic backdrop of seraks and crevasses visible in every direction. The footage would be spectacular. Madison agreed immediately, already pulling out her phone. Ngawang stated flatly that they needed to move. They were behind schedule, the sun was rising, and stopping to film in the middle of the icefall was dangerous. The temperature was already climbing. He could feel it in the air, the shift from the deep cold of night to the relative warmth that came with direct sunlight. The ice was softening, and the seraks above them were becoming unstable. Brianna's response was dismissive. She pointed out that dozens of other climbers filmed in the icefall, that they had seen content from this exact location, and that they weren't doing anything unusual. Ngawang repeated that other climbers departed on time and moved quickly. Brianna and Madison had done neither, which meant their margins were gone. Standing still beneath unstable ice while the morning warmed was the kind of decision that killed people. Madison stated they would only take a few minutes. Ngawang could wait ahead if he was uncomfortable. They would catch up once they finished. The statement revealed how completely they had failed to understand their situation. They believed they could make independent decisions about risk because they had paid for the expedition. What they didn't grasp was that paying for a guided climb didn't purchase control over the mountain or immunity from physics. Ngawang made his position clear. If they stopped to film, he would consider them to have refused his guidance. He would continue upward alone and report their decision to the expedition leader. They could proceed at their own risk, but he would not wait beneath unstable seraks while they created content. His responsibility was to guide clients who followed his instructions, not to enable people determined to ignore warnings. The ultimatum created a brief standoff. Brianna and Madison exchanged looks that communicated their shared frustration. They had paid significant money for this expedition, had trained for months, and felt entitled to document their experience on their own terms. They viewed Ngawang's warnings as overcautious, rooted in a risk-averse mindset that didn't account for their confidence and preparation. Brianna made the decision. They would take 5 minutes to film, then catch up. If Ngawang wanted to go ahead, that was his choice. Madison set up the shot, positioning herself to capture Brianna with the icefall stretching dramatically behind her. They recorded multiple takes, adjusting framing and delivery until they had footage they could use. The content captured their exhaustion, their determination, and the spectacular environment surrounding them. What it didn't capture was Ngawang's expression as he watched them ignore his final warning. The filming lasted 7 minutes. When they finished, they resumed moving upward. Ngawang had continued ahead, maintaining his pace. They could see his headlamp, perhaps 60 yards above them, disappearing around a corner between ice walls. The morning had grown noticeably warmer. The temperature had climbed into the low 20s, and direct sunlight was now hitting portions of the upper icefall. The ice surrounding them had begun the subtle transformation that occurred every morning as solar radiation penetrated the frozen surface. At 6:20, a short distance above where they had stopped to film, Brianna and Madison were traversing beneath a serak that towered roughly 70 feet above the route. The serak was massive, a wall of compressed ice that had fractured from the glacier upstream and now hung suspended at an angle that defied gravity. Fixed ropes guided the route directly beneath it, following the only viable path through that section. The hazard was obvious, but unavoidable. Climbers accepted the risk because no alternative existed. The serak had been stable when the first teams passed beneath it in the pre-dawn cold. Dozens of climbers had crossed safely while the ice remained locked in place by the overnight freeze. But by 6:20, conditions had changed. The sun had been hitting the upper portion of the serak for nearly 20 minutes. Solar radiation was beginning to work into the fracture planes, subtly weakening the structure and changing stresses that had held steady overnight. The serak was entering the transition state that occurred every morning, a brief window where forces that had been balanced in the cold began shifting toward collapse. The sound came first, a sharp crack like a gunshot, followed immediately by a deep groaning that resonated through the glacier. Brianna looked up just as the serak detached. The collapse occurred in stages, rather than all at once. The upper section sheared away first, a block of ice estimated at 30 tons that dropped vertically for perhaps 20 feet before striking the main body of the serak. The impact triggered a cascade failure. The entire structure, hundreds of tons of ice, broke apart and fell. The distance between the serak and the route was approximately 40 feet horizontally. The falling ice covered that distance in less than 2 seconds. Brianna and Madison had no time to react, no opportunity to run or take cover. The wall of ice and debris hit them while they were still looking upward, trying to process what was happening. The impact was instantaneous and catastrophic. Both women were struck by ice blocks moving at devastating speed. The force was equivalent to being hit by vehicles moving at highway speeds. Brianna's body was thrown 15 feet from the route and disappeared into a crevasse. Madison was buried under several tons of ice and debris where she stood. The collapse continued for approximately 8 seconds, depositing thousands of tons of ice across a 100-yard section of the route before the movement stopped and the mountain fell silent. Ngawang heard the collapse from his position a short distance ahead. The sound was unmistakable, a roar that drowned out every other noise, followed by the cascade of smaller pieces settling. He turned and looked back towards the dust cloud rising from the collapse site. His first thought was whether anyone had been caught. His second thought, arriving with sick certainty, was that Brianna and Madison had been directly beneath that serak when he passed it minutes earlier. He descended as quickly as the terrain allowed, shouting into his radio for assistance. Other Sherpas who had heard the collapse were already moving toward the site from positions above and below. When Ngawang reached the debris field, he found the route obliterated. Where fixed ropes had guided the path, there was now only broken ice and fresh rubble. He spotted Madison's pack first, partially visible beneath a block of ice. The block was too large to move without equipment. Brianna was not visible anywhere on the surface. Ngawang and 2 other Sherpas began digging through the debris, working frantically while knowing the effort was almost certainly futile. Bodies buried under tons of ice in a collapse of that magnitude did not survive. They located Madison's body 12 minutes after the collapse. She had been killed instantly, her injuries incompatible with life. Brianna's body was not found that day. The crevasse into which she had been thrown was too deep and unstable to search safely. Her body was recovered 4 days later by a team using technical rope systems, extracted from approximately 80 feet, down in a slot barely wider than her shoulders. The investigation concluded that the collapse resulted from normal serak behavior amplified by warming conditions. The timing of Brianna and Madison's passage beneath the structure, delayed by their decision to stop and film, placed them in the hazard zone during the window of maximum instability. Ngawang's written statement detailed his repeated warnings and their refusal to adjust their behavior. The expedition company faced no penalties, protected by the liability waivers both women had signed. Brianna Cole was 24 years old. Madison Hart was 23. Their final post stayed up only briefly before it was removed, but screen recordings spread anyway, sparking a wave of criticism over how openly they dismissed Sherpa guidance. Ngawang continued guiding, but left the company that hired him for an operator that screened clients more strictly and gave Sherpas real authority to end climbs when safety protocols were ignored. Thanks for watching. Want to watch more? Click on your screen now.